The folks at Byron Seeds believe organic requires a different perspective, plan, and approach. Organic isn't simply a different type of product or even a different way of farming. It's a different way of thinking, planning, commitment. It's a different philosophy on how to feed the world. Many won't understand, but the people at Byron Seeds do. We're owned by organic dairy farmers. We not only have the product, but we plan, manage, and execute organic. We speak your language, we share your struggles, and we laud your successes. Organic isn't a way of doing business, it's a community. We learn from each other. We're in this together. We'd be glad to talk cropping plans, management systems, the road to profitability. We understand what you're trying to do. We're farmers just like you. Visit us at byronseeds.net or give us a call at 800-801-3596. And thanks to Byron Seeds.
You're listening to Rooted in Organic podcast. I'm Mike Klein, and along with Brian Wood today, we are joined by Jacob Powsner, who is the co-owner of Baird Maple Farm in Chittendon, Vermont. It is, I believe, a fourth-generation farm founded in 1918. So, Jacob, thank you so much for joining us. Can you give us a little bit of an introduction and the history of your farm?
Sure. Thanks, Mike. Happy to be here. Baird Farm, we're a maple farm for the most part in central Vermont, although we have a couple other kind of side hustles. It's a 585 acre farm. We have about 120-ish acres of open land that we mostly graze beef cattle with another young guy, Jamie Hamilton of Hamilton Cattle Company. But we really pay our bills here making and selling maple syrup. One way of thinking about the scale of maple farms is we often talk about maple in terms of the amount of trees or taps we stick in trees. And on our farm, we tap 14,500 trees. That makes us about a medium-sized farm for the state of Vermont. There's a lot of really big farms in maple, and there's still a lot of small-scale backyard hobbyists in maple. And so for the past 100 years of this farm, cows have always been a component. We used to milk here and sell to Agrimark for many years. And as the milk markets, at least in the Northeast, are very difficult, the family sold the milking herd. We raised dairy heifers, but sugaring was always kind of a side hustle. And we made an intentional pivot maybe 20-ish years ago. And now most of what we do is with maple, and we do a little bit of other things, like cut your own Christmas trees.
So you said there are still some cattle. Is that just beef cattle?
Yeah, just some Red Devons and Black Angus, and all grass-fed. And we help market the steaks, and we have a little retail shop here at our sugar house, and we do cow shares and whatnot. But no more milking on the farm. Yeah. And so we really spend a lot of time with maple. We're recording this in February. We just finished tapping all of our trees. So I'm not sure how much folks at home know about maple, but every year we need to drill new holes into trees, right? Fresh holes that we drill into the xylem of the tree, the sapwood of the tree. Every year we pound little spouts into those holes, and we wait until the weather warms up. Out in Ohio there, you're probably a little bit earlier than us. Normally we think about the peak of our season in March. So we've had a couple sap runs here, but not really enough to boil yet. Next month will be a pretty big production month. Yeah.
Yep, I've just seen more and more taps in the last week because we had a really cold winter. So then we had a couple of days over freezing. So there's been small early runs, but I haven't actually stopped in on any of the maple farms to see how big that first run was. But now we're supposed to get another cold snap, so it's going to be a little bit later here this year than normal.
Yeah, the past couple of years have been very mild. In Vermont, everyone had what was thought to be maybe the biggest year ever last year, and because of some of the tools and tech in sugaring, which we can nerd out about, people are tapping trees earlier and earlier, right? So climate change, we're getting warmer weather earlier, but people are also kind of making more syrup on the shoulder of the season, especially the larger the farm. So, I mean, we're around a lot of farms where they tap 50,000 trees or so. And they're not opposed to drilling holes in early December, late November, even. And if it's a warm Christmas, they'll turn on vacuum pumps and start gathering sap and start boiling it in.
And
Our,
Jacob, we did have another maple producer on a number of years ago now. So if anybody wants to go back and listen, that's available. But I always find it fascinating. You started to go into some of the, background of, tapping trees, what happens, the sap run. But that's the part that I always find interesting and like nerding out before we get into the equipment piece. Like with 14,500 trees, how much sap are you getting and what does that boil down to? And some of those kinds of things. I'd really like to hear the whole process.
yeah. Let me pull it apart a little bit. So, this farm used to run a lot of buckets. Picture in your head like the Norman Rockwell postcards of old, right? Like the rusty bucket that hangs on the tree with the lid. There's no more buckets on this farm. I legally can't sell syrup on the internet from a rusty bucket anymore because galvanized steel and lead and food safety, and so it's all tubing. And even if we wanted to do all buckets, we wouldn't because it's way more efficient and faster to tap trees off tubing. Think in your head kind of the blue flexible plumbing that ties all the trees together. So a lot of modern sugaring is essentially outdoor plumbing. It's kind of like the unromantic way of looking at it. It's kind of like an irrigation system in reverse. So we build the sugar bushes, right? Sugar bush is a word for where your maple trees are, the stand of forest. We build them on hills and we run the tubing down so that it will all drain down to some low spot, whereas you build a collection point or a pump house where you'd stick a big bucket that you can haul the sap from. And so on our farm, we have maybe 110 miles of tubing in the woods. Maybe 10,000 fittings, right? Think in your head, little plumb, like little Y's and T's and Legos that keep all of the system in place. And that's what we use to gather the sap. That's the language we use in Maple World, gather, because it's kind of like a wild product still, which kind of makes it unique. What we gather from the tree, right, is not syrup. A lot of people think you just get syrup straight from the tree. What we gather from the tree is sap. And most people, when I say sap, in their head, they think thick and brown and sticky sap. But as you pointed out, Brian, it takes a lot of sap to make a little bit of syrup. So here we might gather next month 400,000 some gallons of sap. It's a good season. It's a large amount of liquid. And we will boil that down to maybe 7,000 some gallons of syrup. The sap is mostly water. It's 98% water, at least on average, often more, 2% sugar. So the general rule of thumb, sugar makers say, is somewhere between 40 to 60 gallons of sap can be boiled down to about a gallon of syrup.
One thing that I'm thinking is with 110 miles of tubing, just the logistics and 14,500 spiles you're putting into trees. What is it? How do you store that? How do you set it up? How long does it take to tap that many trees? What's some of those details?
Yeah, let's get into it. So this farm, like a lot of farms, this farm in Maple World has recently changed. The maple industry is like a relatively a success story in modern agriculture. The industry has quintupled in size in the past 20 years. And so we've doubled in size here. So we found more trees, we've strung more tubing. Partially, this is because better pricing for maple, demand is up, and partially like these tools on tapping and gathering have gotten better. So they've had tubing for a long time. Think like post World War II, the research universities had tubing, like University of Vermont, University of Cornell. Cornell University, where they have maple research. They've used tubing for a long time. When the sap starts to run, and you need a freeze-thaw cycle, this is important, right? Well, you need temps that go above and below freezing. What happens inside the tree is there's a pressure dynamic. The trees that we're tapping, maple trees for the most part, sugar maple trees, the gas expands under warm weather inside the tree. And so that's why these trees undergo positive pressure. That's why if you drill a hole into the tree, it will go drip, drip, drip from where there's positive pressure to where there's less pressure. Or on a vacuum system, negative pressure. So the vacuum is really important for us when we turn on a vacuum pump, same vacuum pump you would have in a milk house, right? We might get 2 to 3 times more sap. Every tapping season is different here. A lot of it depends on the weather, right? A lot of it depends on how much snow is on the ground. We're about knee deep in our woods right now. And we have a big, I don't know, we might get 10 inches on Sunday, but we're all tapped here, which is nice because it would be 5 times slower to tap on snowshoes than it is if you can walk more easily on bare ground. I can tap 200 trees a day. I can tap 500-600 trees a day. A lot of it depends on the terrain. The older the tree, the tougher they are to tap, right? Because you're looking for older wounds. You're trying to stay away from those. You want to tap the tree in a healthy spot. All of those play a big role. Yeah.
Are there multiple taps, like a big old sugar maple? Are there multiple taps on that?
Yeah, I will stick 2 spouts in a tree. We're certified organic here. And there's a number of things that go into what makes maple organic versus conventional. Half of those requirements deal with how we work in the woods. So think like forest management plans. We have tapping guidelines that we get inspected by organic folks every year. Some of those guidelines are don't stick 4 spouts in a tree, right? Make sure a tree is big enough to handle the amount of damage you're doing with the drilling of the holes. So there's probably not 14,500. I know there's not 14,500 individual trees here. There's probably closer to like 11,000 trees and a few thousand and a half 2-tap trees. If you're doing this at home, feeling inspired to tap a tree, what old timers in Vermont would say is if you can hug the tree and not touch your fingers, or up north they say if you can't cross your wrists, then you could put 2 taps on it. How they make these tapping guidelines is someone has measured average radial growth, like how tall and how wide a tree is growing. And you can also measure the scarring you make by drilling holes into trees. They call that non-conductive xylem. Basically, when you drill a hole into the tree, that's a spot that's never going to really carry liquid and gas again. It's almost like scar tissue. And especially when we talk about long-term tree health, we want to make sure the tree is growing faster than the rate of the poking and prodding. When it comes to making certified organic syrup, a lot of that has to do with inside the sugar house. When we boil that sap down into syrup, right? Sugaring is a lot like brewing almost, right? You're dealing with tanks and filters and pumps and heating and plumbing. And so there's cleaning products we use. We have to use a defoamer. There's filtering products we use, and those all have to comply to organic standards.
One question in there on the trees I was going to ask is,
how long can you tap a tree? And like what I mean is there a certain amount of years that, after a while you've done enough scarring that you can no longer tap that tree, or does it repair itself enough and keep on growing that there's basically, as long as it's alive, you can keep on tapping the tree?
It's more you can kind of tap a tree until it's done. So there's trees on this farm. Mike opened up. He said the farm was started in 1918 by great grandmother Sarah Baird, and we actually tapped trees. We tapped trees last month that Sarah Baird tapped back in 1918, which is pretty cool and special. I mean, we're talking about a sugar maple tree is a dominant hardwood species. They can live like 250 300 years old. There's really older maple trees too that you can find in like arboretums that are like being well cared for. Every year I will pull spouts from trees. If I think they're unproductive on the vacuum system, I can tell if a tree is being productive or not, sometimes just by the amount of sap or the amount of gas that's leaving the spout. But every year we also add trees. Right, and producers do a different amount of woods management when we talk about like promoting maple growth, thinning stands of trees. Since we're certified organic, we have rules around this too, right? We need to meet certain biodiversity threshold indexes, etc. when we work in the woods.
When on the flip side, you said every year you're adding some trees. Of course, to me as an amateur, I'm thinking, oh, you planted some trees and now they're all of a sudden producing. But I guess my question would be, if you did that, how long, and from when you planted to when it's fully grown how many years is that you would be able to tap a tree and add it to your sugar bush, so to speak?
I like to tap a tree that's at least 12 inches in diameter at breast height. DBH is the forestry terminology. And some trees look a lot older than they are, like some people look a lot older than they are, living that good life. These trees, right, if they grow up on a tree line or in an open field, you can grow a maple tree pretty fast. But we're not planting any trees, like I kind of alluded to earlier, right? They're all wild trees that are coming up often under the canopy of another tree. So here, I normally say these trees are at least 30 years old before we end up tapping them. It kind of makes it unique in terms of agriculture. You do hear stories about people planting maple trees, but they're not really planting those trees for their lifetime. They're maybe planting those trees for the next generation. Yeah.
So I worked in forestry for quite a few years, and the interesting thing, when you go into an old growth oak forest, the only thing that's growing under the oak trees is maple, because oak trees will not allow young acorns won't grow under an oak tree, but the maples will. So with that old growth forest, you'll have the giant canopy of the oaks and then a secondary canopy of the maple trees coming. It's pretty neat to see.
Yeah. I mean, forests are both magical and mysterious places. We know like this much about maple, but we do know that if you're in the business of making maple syrup, it almost always pays off to do some sort of forest management before you go in and you set up this tubing system that we've been talking about, right? Because if you're actually pulling out firewood, say you're burning wood to run a maple evaporator, or say you're pulling out logs because you want to release younger maples underneath, it's very difficult to do that with tubing systems in place. So most maple farmers, if they're thinking about an expansion, they'll thin their woods and then they'll set up their tubing systems. And now a lot of farmers are putting in like monitoring systems, which we've done here with Farm Blocks. So we can get data, because we said 110 miles of tubing. There's 240 acres of sugar bush here that we manage, mostly between there's really two of us that do most of the woods work. I can set little solar panels in the woods with antennae that can ping data points to me around temperature or around the amount of vacuum that we have in the woods. Because most of our job, Brian asked earlier how long it takes to tap the trees. It doesn't take that long to tap trees. We tapped our entire woods here in 3.5 weeks. Most of our job to get a good yield, to get a good crop, has to do with fixing the leaks of the tubing out in the woods.
So how do those farm blocks, do they show leaks so you can pinpoint where the leaks are, or are you literally walking 110 miles of tube to find all the leaks? Because I imagine the main lines are probably there all year round, right?
Yeah, the main lines, the larger lines, like think inch lines or 2-inch lines, right, that are holding a lot of capacity, those are out in the woods all year round. And on our farm, our lateral lines stay up too. So these smaller tubing lines might connect 3 to 5 trees. And the tech that we use is getting better and better every year. So part of the story of modern maple, I said it's growing so much. Partially that is because people are able to more efficiently get better yields off and manage larger swaths of woodlands with less and less humans than ever before. Some of that has to do with inside the sugar house, which we could talk about, like reverse osmosis. And a lot of it has to do with getting better at finding leaks. And so we run a vacuum system where we try to get 28 inches of vacuum. Vacuum is measured in inches per mercury. It's just a weird unit system. But we can run a 10 horsepower vacuum pump and have pretty powerful suction on the ends of all the trees. Sometimes the metaphor I use is like the tool in the dentist's office, the Schlurp tool. You can imagine that on all the ends of the spouts, right? And when you're getting that much vacuum, you're getting that much more sap. The number I often reference is you get about 10% more sap for every inch of vacuum.
But even with vacuum, because growing up we had buckets. We had buckets and the old metal spile that you would tap in until the place where the bucket hangs on was against the tree. With vacuum now, it's not possible to draw that much sap out of a tree that it'll kill it, is there?
From what we know, which again I said this much about the known universe, from what we know, vacuum has no long-term health impacts on the tree. And the places like Cornell or University of Vermont or up in Quebec, where a lot of syrup is made north of the border in Quebec, the long-term studies around vacuum and tree health, it doesn't impact the health of the tree. Partially, we know this because at the end of the season, you can't like suck a tree dry. You're pulling the vacuum from this one vessel, this vein almost of xylem, and at the end of the season, the tree is starting to compartmentalize and heal up that damage. So you get less drops at the end of the season, and the drops are less sweet, even if you still have high vacuum. A lot of the carbohydrates that the tree has made during photosynthesis, right? A lot of those carbs go back up to making new leaves and buds for the springtime.
And is that where the term buddy sap comes in? Once the maple trees start budding, you get a darker, more stronger tasting syrup?
Yeah. You know the term well. Some people, depending on the region, they have different words for it. Some people call it woody. In Canada, they sometimes say woody a little bit different. So there are retail grades of syrup that most folks are used to if you're buying syrup in the grocery mart, right? You're usually getting some sort of a grade A, medium-bodied flavored syrup, like amber color, rich taste. It gets a little lighter earlier in the season, and later in the season you make darker, stronger syrups. And after that, there's some commercial grades of syrup, which we will sell on our farm if we make it. But those I legally can't stick in a jug and sell to Brian. The bulk packers have some markets for this commercial grade syrup. Think like meat processing, granola processing. If Kind Bars wants to make a maple bar, but they want to use real maple and not corn syrup or cane syrup that's flavored maple, right? Then they might be interested in some of that buddy late season syrup. So just to get into it a little bit more, like we make batches of syrup. So on any given day, if the weather warms up by the end of February, we might get 10,000 gallons of sap. We store that sap in big vats, like big stainless vats, if you haven't been in a modern sugar house. And as we fill up a tank, I want to make sure I boil it soon. One, I don't want to run out of room. The best syrup, whether you're in Ohio or Vermont or Quebec, it's made fast. And so we drain these vats, we force it through a reverse osmosis filtration process, where here we will pull out 90% of the water, and we bring the sugar content up when we remove water. So by forcing the sap through these really fine membranes under pressure, I can separate clean H2O. And what we make is essentially like a concentrated sap. It's almost like a maple juice. So I will bring that sap up to around 20% sugar content. And that's what we end up cooking on an evaporator. You always need to cook the sap because that's really what gives it the caramelization process. That's what makes the sap turn brown. That's what gives it the flavor that we think of when we think of maple syrup. And so I cook it up to a certain density. All maple syrup, whether it's light syrup, dark syrup, buddy syrup, it should all be the same thickness. And so we use hydrometers, like brewers use hydrometers. We measure sugar densities and we filter syrup. And for the most part, finished syrup is stored in drums or barrels. Most producers fill 40-gallon or 55-gallon drums. And so it's pretty stable once you've boiled it out to that spot.
And so you've got now these you're in the drums, and you mentioned different parts of the season have different color, different flavorings, different profiles, basically. And you mentioned that those are graded differently. Do you have to do that grading yourself? And then is the value to you in selling it off the farm different based on that grading?
Yeah, yes, and yes, question mark, maybe. We do grade all of our own syrup. I don't like to grade syrup hot right off the evaporator. It's best to grade syrup at like room temperature. And there's rules around grading syrup that can be quite technical, and they're written in Vermont, at least they're written into statute law. You can go to vermont.gov and look up the maple syrup laws. And it gets a little nerdy here, but we grade syrup by both the flavor and the color. You can measure this, right? Like you can put a little sample of syrup in a thing that punches light through it, right? So you can measure light transmittance. And light syrup needs to fall within a certain range, and a dark syrup needs to fall within a certain range. But when we sell bulk syrup, they don't trust what I write on the drum. They want to double check it themselves. And we will make a decision at the end of the year how much of the syrup we want to save in-house, because we do direct to consumer retail here. So we sell syrup out of our little farm store, and we ship a lot of syrup online. But we always have a little bit, we make more syrup than we can sell here still. So we sell to folks who are in the business of bulk syrup, is the world that we call it. And there's bulk buyers of syrup that will buy up thousands of barrels from the field. And those are the folks that are really blending syrup, aggregating syrup, and packing syrup for larger distribution chains. Think like H-E-B's in Austin, Texas, or Safeways in Washington State, right? Those places are buying the syrup from a relatively small handful of folks that are aggregating maple from the field.
So one thing I was curious on is, of course, Vermont, and you kind of alluded to it, is well known for their maple syrup. Vermont maple syrup is probably trademarked at this point. But because of where you live and that it's coming from Vermont, when you're wholesaling it, does it have a slightly higher value than, say, if I made it here in the Midwest and was trying to sell into the same markets?
Yeah. It's not trademarked, but it should be. I do get a premium. And I'm not that far from New York. I could drive to New York this afternoon. But our syrup is worth a couple pennies more, depending on who you sell it to, because it's made in the state of Vermont. And that's just that's a brand, right? Like Vermont has built a reputation, partially because of history and quality assurance, for good maple syrup. Vermont makes about half the maple syrup in the United States. Canada makes about 70% of the world's maple syrup. So really, between this border region of southern Quebec and northern Vermont, there's a huge amount of maple syrup that's made, and it's where all the equipment manufacturers are. It's where all the bulk buyers are of all the syrup. But in our state, I'm on the association board in Vermont. We think there's about 3,500 producers, and that ranges from, like, my neighbor Buddy, who will hang 20 buckets on his tree next month, to the largest operation in the world is in northern Vermont, where they tap almost 500,000 trees.
500,000 trees.
Big maple.
Like, yeah. That's major maple. But like, I want to kind of go back to the woods, because that part is so intriguing to me, because I drive down the road and I see all these maple lines, the main lines, and I know just enough vernacular to sound like an idiot. But like, how do you lay out, like, when you get a new sugar bush, and I know you don't just look at it, well, we're going to run the line here. You've got to either map it or somehow, like, is it totally by elevation? Is it find the low point and go from there? Like, how do you start?
Yeah, and it's a good question. It can be overwhelming, and it can be quite fun. And there's a real range of quality installs versus, kind of homemade ratchet installs. A lot of what you're doing is following the contour of the land, and there's resources available for all of this, right? Most maple producing states have some sort of an extension folks at their local university that can help people navigate this. There's a lot of literature online. But the first thing we do is what we were talking about before, maybe tree management, at least counting the trees, right? You want to have some rough idea of how big the parcel is, because you're going to want to size the plumbing accordingly. And then you figure out where you're going to collect it from. A lot of sap all over the Maple Belt region is hauled. And I alluded to this before, but if you don't have a processing sugar house next to your trees, you need to move that sap in a truck or a tanker or through a pumping system from where the trees are to where you need to boil it down. And the first thing we do is we get the contour of the land. You can do this a lot of this online, GIS, tools like that now, but you can also do it by hand with a site level. And we have rules when it comes to pitches and grades. And the first thing we do is we run high tensile wire, almost like a fencing system, like a cattle fence, think that kind of wire. And then we lash the larger lines to that wire so that they stay elevated and on a consistent grade down. And then we start running lateral lines and taps from there.
When you get that new sugar bush, are you running the lines during the summer when the trees are full of leaves and it's way harder to see, or are you actually waiting till fall to kind of scope it out? Or is this I guess a year-round job in the woods side of the maple business?
On our farm, I can speak about our farm and then I can speak about other farms. On our farm, it's not quite year-round woods maintenance. Some of the tubing requires maintenance, right? The plastic breaks down to UV and other things. It gets brittle, it gets dirtier over time. Dirtier tubing generally means less sap yields. But we will start working in the woods oftentimes in the fall if we're not like pushing out a brand new expansion. There's operators like the folks I was talking about that tap over 100,000 trees. They like to keep their crews busy. So they'll hire out their crews to install woods for other folks, right, that might not have the knowledge or know-how, but have the cash flow to get a woods professionally installed. The woods in the summertime is great, but it can be buggy, right? So sugar makers aren't scared of cold weather, as long as the snow's not too deep, which they've measured. It takes 5 times longer to install tubing in knee-deep snow than it does if you're on bare ground.
I can imagine that would be a little bit frustrating, traipsing from tree to tree in waist deep snow. Do you have to clean all the lines, or is the sap sterile enough that there's no buildup? Because it is sugar water, and you would think there should be some sugar buildup over years.
Yeah, this is a focus of research. Maple research is basically like tubing hygiene is a lot of what folks call it. The best management practice 20 years ago was to wash your lines, either with water or with a bleach solution. We used to wash our lines with water here. They have since kind of stepped that recommendation back, and almost no one I know of in this region washes their tubing anymore with water. They found that when you add water to the system, you're actually giving it more culture for bacteria to grow in, if that makes any sense. When we pull our spouts at the end of the year, right? So every year, new hole in a tree, new spout, brand new spout. We don't wash our spouts anymore because that keeps the spout cleaner too, that we're putting in the wound. When we pull our spouts at the end of the season, the tree will start to heal up. And we pull the spouts under that vacuum system, and that helps drain a lot of the old sap out of the system. And now what most folks recommend, like University of Vermont, is just to replace the bit of tubing that's closest to the tree every 3 to 4 years. And if you do that, you might get 10 to 15% more sap. Up in Canada, they use isopropyl alcohol, which works great. And I think there's a lot of producers in the States that might use isopropyl alcohol too, but it is not approved for maple use, according to the FDA, for a number of legal wonky things. So people have different products that they use on tubing to try to maintain cleanliness.
Do you plug the hole, or will the hole just naturally heal itself, within a year's time?
Yeah, maybe not a year's time, but again, depending on the health of the tree, right? An older tree, like we were talking about earlier, those will take longer to heal up that wound. But a younger, fast-growing maple can heal up a wound in a year for sure. So we don't use, and sometimes in arborist worlds, there's tree sealants and things like that they use. We don't do any of that. These trees have naturally adapted over time to kind of seal off that wounded damage. That's one of the reasons why a maple tree is tappable and like an oak tree is not. In order to tap a tree, it basically needs 2 physical characteristics. It needs compartmentalization, which is what we're talking about. And it also needs a high density xylem, which is like, it's a high pressure tree. We briefly touched upon this earlier, but like that's what will really give a good sap run if it's a high pressure tree.
Are there any other trees that are tapped besides maple?
Oh yeah. Most commonly, and this is like we're getting into the deep nerddom, but people will tap birch trees to make birch syrup. Have you heard about this before?
I have not. I have only heard maple syrup.
Yeah, birch is sometimes you see it up in Alaska, but the folks around here will make birch syrup too. It's not done as commonly because the sap from the birch tree is half as sweet as the sap from the maple tree. So I don't think it, I mean, you should try it. It's interesting. I don't think it tastes as good as maple syrup, of course, but I'm a little biased. But so it might take 100 gallons of birch sap to make a gallon of birch syrup. So it's a much more of a specialty value add when we talk about a crop versus maple, but it uses all the same tools and tech that we're talking about, like tubing, vacuum, like these vacuum monitors we touched upon briefly, reverse osmosis machines. So many maple farms are kind of set up to tap birch trees, and the birch run happens after maple. Think like closer to May, April.
I know my sister tapped an ash tree. We couldn't figure out why there was nothing in that bucket, and then Dad goes, "Well, that's an ash tree." So there was nothing in there.
Yeah.
But going back to these monitoring systems, like what do they tell you? Are they like at the collection point? Are they throughout the runs? Like what are they doing with that data, I guess I should say?
So we can do a lot. Partially, like data is cool for us nerds, just for data. Like good farmers are good record keepers. You know what I'm talking about? Like the best farmers I know have really good records, and they pay attention to those records and they use those records to inform their decisions. How I use the monitors is as a tool to get better at finding vacuum leaks. But I have monitors on things other than vacuum. So Farm Blocks also built some tank sensors for us, right? And tank sensors are used in like food world all the time for different purposes, right? But when we have a tank filling up, I wish I was in the sugar house, I could show you guys. We have several tanks that are like 7,000 gallons. They're the size of large swimming pools. And on this farm, I can fill a 7,000 gallon tank in 2 hours on the peak season. We can get 3,000 some gallons of sap being pumped into our sugar house at once. Yeah, it's like a small creek flowing at you. And so, and sometimes this happens at 10 o'clock at night. Sometimes it happens at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm often out in the woods trying to fix these vacuum leaks. So it's really handy to be able to open up your iPhone and be able to see on your phone how fast the tank is going up, right? So I can get estimated flow rates. SAP runs, and this is a historical thing, like SAP runs are notoriously hard to predict. There is a point in the season when the frost leaves the ground and the snow finally starts to melt around the tree where we will get buckets and buckets and buckets of sap, but we can never really predict what day it's going to be. So I have tank monitors, but then I have vacuum monitors, and the vacuum monitors do certain things, right? If you have vacuum monitors on all your main line and a spout gets pulled off by wind, or there's a lot of animal damage in the woods, as you can imagine, mostly from squirrels and chipmunks. Squirrels and chipmunks chew the tubing. And when they chew on the tubing, again, I'm not worried it's going to go drip, drip, drip there. It's going to go. And since it's all connected, it's a contiguous spider web of plumbing, it's going to burn down the vacuum everywhere. But if I see on line S10 on the West Mountain that line has 2 inches of less vacuum on it, I know I better go out there and find it. So I can't pinpoint it to a lateral like we were talking about before. I can't pinpoint it to a spout, but I can pinpoint it to maybe 100 spouts, and you go out there and you walk the lines.
Will you be able to hear the vacuum sucking if it's a big enough hole, or do you have to just like walk along that line and look till you find it?
It depends on the day. Early in the season, we find a lot of big leaks, right? Like trees I missed tapping that become vacuum leaks, right? Because I forgot to stick a spout in them. And then later in the season, we find tiny, tiny little leaks, right? We're talking about like maybe I shoved the fitting onto the tubing in a cockeye way, so there's a little what we call micro leaks. Those leaks you're using your eyes to see, bubbles rushing through the line because it's sucking outside air. There's some amount of bubbles that are naturally occurring in the line that we're pulling gas from the tree. And then if I see fast moving bubbles, I know there's a leak there. But yeah, you are out there manually walking the lines, and I try not to blast my podcasts when I do because I got to use my ears to find the leaks. And then the cool thing that like Farm Blocks monitors do, and this is probably too weedy, but we have gotten better at finding. It's changed how producers find leaks at the transitions of the day. If I'm looking at my monitor and it's 10 o'clock at night and it's dropping below freezing, the lines that freeze first will be the lines that will have the leaks on it the following day when it thaws out again. Because if it is sucking air, say a squirrel chewed a giant hole in a line, it's sucking air and it's causing ice and it's causing the whole line to freeze. Does this make sense? Or maybe a tree fell on a line. There's trees fall in the woods all the time. right? And if it's pinning a line down in the snow, that sap isn't going to drain. It's going to create a little pond of sap there and an ice dam. And so first thing I do when I get up before dawn, I check the monitors, I check the freeze reports, I see which lines are still frozen. The lines that are still frozen and not thawing out fast are lines that we have leaks on. When you see the whole system at like a 30,000 foot view, you can do tricks like this. And this is why there's farms that tap hundreds of thousands of trees. They run big woods crew, like they have a large labor budget, but they have a smaller labor budget because of tools like farm blocks monitoring.
So if you don't have any monitoring system, would you have walked all the lines every day? Or would you have just checked for the, like you said, the fast moving bubbles and then knew you had a system or a problem with that part of the system?
It depends on how many of us go out to the woods. We can walk our whole woods here in like 3-4 days. Not every lateral, but every main line. And we still do. Like some of these equipment dealers sell you monitoring equipment as like, oh, you'll just be able to hang out in the sugar house and watch Netflix all day long. And that's not really the case. You end up getting better at finding more leaks faster than ever before, getting better yields, which encourage most producers to find more trees to tap because they feel like they can manage larger swaths of woodland.
It essentially creates a little bit more actual work for you because you're fine, but it's creating the efficiency that pays for that additional work to a certain extent, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah,
and it helps you pinpoint so you're not just walking around haphazard hoping to find something. You're looking for something.
Yeah, you're looking for something. It gives you a little bit more direction. It gives you like a little bit, it's actually kind of like gamified, for better or worse. Like I get, because now I get vacuum that's within hundredths of an inch. There's analog gauges throughout the woods. There's hundreds of gauges, right? And there's different strategies for checking gauges or opening valves and closing valves and pinpointing roughly where leaks are. But we get really hyper obsessive about vacuum now. Back in the day, that wasn't the case. Bob, my father-in-law, who owns the farm, and really I'm kind of his minion. He just pulled the vacuum pump out of the milk house, and they stuck it on the trees, literally. Like they ran a line from the milking parlor out to the trees, and he would be happy if it got to 20 inches of vacuum. But like I said before, people are getting better at plumbing systems that really maximize vacuum at the tap, and it pays for it. Sugar makers have a saying that the money is made in the woods, but it's spent in the sugar house.
So then on the boiling process, or the evaporating process, do you need X amount of gallons before you do a run? So do you want, say, it's running through the reverse osmosis system, so you've got the sap down to 20% sugars. How many gallons do you need for a run, or what do you call it? Is a run the right word?
Sure. Well, normally when I say run, I'm talking about like when the sap is running. When I'm talking about boiling, I don't know what language I use, a batch maybe, or we will run the evaporator often if we get maybe close to 5,000-6,000 gallons of sap. We could run it off a small batch, and sometimes we do. My main concern there is I need a certain amount of clean water off the reverse osmosis machine to clean the machine. So when you force sap through a reverse osmosis machine, you get a lot of what we're talking about, the concentrated sap, which will become syrup. But I save every last drop of clean water that I have storage for, because those reverse osmosis machines, those membranes need to basically be back flushed. They need to be rinsed and washed and rinsed again. And the size machine that we have, which can handle 3,500 gallons of sap an hour, we need maybe 4,000 some gallons of water every time we use that machine. So our batches can vary. Sometimes I will make a batch, and we might, at the end of the season, we might just make a drum a day or 2 drums a day when those tap holes are drying out. And on the busiest days of the season, think like March 12th last year, We boiled 10, 12 drums a day, stopped mid-boil, cleaned the evaporator, and boiled again just to stay on top of it.
Oh, that's super interesting. What is your heat source for the evaporator? Is it gas or are you still wood fired?
We used to be wood fired for many, many years, and we're on oil now. Most producers in Vermont aren't on gas. There's like a natural gas operation. I know of one farm that boils on natural gas. 90 some percent of maple farmers in Vermont use oil. There's some new technologies out there, like electric evaporators are becoming more and more common, partially because of climate concerns, partially because they're coming out of, a lot of the equipment is manufactured in Quebec, and in Quebec there's large hydro dams, if you're not familiar, so they really incentivize electricity use in Quebec in a way that they don't in Vermont. And then the really big producers, the kind of the large scale farms that we were talking about before, they're really moving towards steam. So they might have a steam boiler, right, where they generate steam off, let's say, oil, and they pipe that steam over to a closed evaporator that just circulates the steam, and the sap is evaporating in the steam, and you get a really even, nice evaporation and an easy to clean evaporator. You can't ever burn syrup off steam, but you can certainly burn syrup if you're not paying attention to a wood-fired or oil-fired evaporator.
I know that from experience. Our old sugar shed burned down, and then one year when I was doing it, yeah, the whole pan caught fire, and all Dad's corn crib almost left.
Oh boy, that's hectic.
Yeah,
Yeah, it can come up on you fast, especially if you're playing a good podcast. Sugar houses are kind of hangout spaces, so there's often like more than one person there. Some people drink beer in sugar houses. I don't drink beer in our sugar house. It's kind of like a working space. But when you burn a pan, it can be game over, as you know, right? Like, it's a dangerous thing, and we hear about sugar houses every year in Vermont that burn down. And if you burn a pan, you either at least ruin the batch because you add a scorched off flavor. But you can ruin pans, right? Those pans can warp, and you can crack welds, and it's hard to get service in the middle of maple season, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, for sure. So you had mentioned, the finished product. I was just on your website. You have a lot of different cool products there. Like, I see ketchup, sriracha, all kinds of stuff that uses maple syrup instead of corn syrup. So way to go. Are all those products are sold online and in your store, and they're all certified organic?
Most of them are. Some of them we make ourselves, and some of them we partner with folks. So there's like a whole section of things, like we sell our own granulated sugar that we make from our maple syrup. We sell all the top retail grades of syrup in jugs and glasses and cans, all of different formats. We do make that maple ketchup in-house. It is organic. I don't have that ketchup certified organic. The ketchup is just like a hobby. but we have quite a few other infused syrups, right, where we're taking wild forage things like spruce tips or birch bark or sumac berries, and then we're hot steeping it in a drum of maple syrup. Those are quite popular all over the States. You'll see folks have like vanilla bean infused maple syrup now, or bourbon barrel aged syrup. So those are kind of a woodsier, wild take on infused syrups. Yeah.
Is there any maple bourbon like that is literally made from maple syrup?
Oh yeah,
not just infused?
You can make spirits from maple. Most products you see are kind of what you're talking about, Mike, or it's back sweetened, right? So they might make a spirit and they'll add a little bit of maple, because you can ferment all the sugar out of maple. For the most part, you see like maple wines is sometimes what they're called. The technical term, if folks at home are as nerdy as I am, they can Google Acer Glen. It's like a maple mead. And so you take a sap and you either boil it a little bit longer, or you take a concentrated sap and you pitch it with, let's say, champagne yeast. And you get something that is like, I don't know, it's really good. It's almost like apple cider. It's almost like a hard cider, or like or a wine, like a funky white wine that doesn't really taste mapley because you fermented all the sugars out of it.
One thing I was going to ask, I guess I just have two more questions before we wrap up here. Uh, One is like the market. So you've kind of referenced, and I think you mentioned it earlier, that it's been a growing industry, and I think you were referring to the amount that is coming out, but correct me if I'm wrong. And typically, and we see this in commodity agriculture, as things get more efficient and you get more out of a inch of soil or one tree or whatever it is, typically the price comes down. I think of corn or milk or any of those things that we've seen those cycles happen. Do you see that in maple as well? And what are the things that impact that market and the price you get, or is it typically a pretty value added, high value, sought after product that you have some stability in what it is that you're receiving for price?
Sure. Yeah, let's talk about the big economy things, which just briefly, and then we can zoom in if you want. The maple is bought and sold kind of like a commodity. A lot of what we were just talking about, like on our website, like we can control that price, based off of our own costs and expenses and what we think it's worth. But when we talk about bulk syrup, syrup that's bought and sold by the pound, a lot of the price is impacted or structured from what the folks up north of us in Quebec are doing. There's a maple cartel up north. Have you heard of this? A little bit? No? Okay. In Quebec, there is a federation of producers, and it kind of functions like a non-consensual co-op. They stockpile syrup up north. Folks are giving oftentimes quotas on how many trees they can tap. And nobody's really allowed to sell bulk syrup like we can in the United States. They have to sell their syrup to a centralized warehouse, and they get paid when it leaves the cooperative warehouse. And in doing so, the Canadians have cushioned a lot of the harms of commodity agriculture because they're able to stockpile enough syrup, the lion's share of syrup, and they can buffer supply and demand spikes, right? Like good year, bad year, like there's a lot of corn on the market, there's a little bit of corn on the market, and you got this ping pong effect on the price. With maple, the Canadians will set a price every year depending on how good the crop is, right? If they had a great year, the Canadians might say maple syrup is worth $2.30 a pound, $2.30 a pound. And there's really 4 or 5 really big maple outfits in the States, and they see that Canadian, they wait until the Canadian price comes out, and it's ostensibly the floor for the United States price. And so they'll say, we're going to buy in syrup at $2.31 a pound. If it's organic, we'll buy it in at $2.41 a pound. If it's organic and it's made in Vermont, it's $2.44 a pound. If you're selling them your own drums and they're stainless steel drums, you might get an extra penny or two. If you're hauling the syrup yourself to the bottling facilities, you might get an extra penny or two. Does this help provide a lay of the land?
Yeah, it does. And you started to touch on what my next question was going to be, is the value add of being organic as well. And it sounds like that's at least a price premium over other what I guess conventional maple.
I mean, I'm worried about downward price pressure, just like folks are in other ag, right? And it's a real problem because it's really hard to compete with really big farms. There's economies of scale, right, to all of these things. And how we compete here at Baird Farm is we go direct to the consumer, right? Which we see in food markets kind of everywhere. And there are premiums, and some of those premiums, like I really believe in the organic program, and we do a lot of work with the organic folks, our certifiers in NOFA Vermont and Vermont organic farmers. They're really the only people going into the woods talking about sugar bush health on an annual basis. The organic premium used to be about a quarter. It's down to about 10 cents, but it can go anywhere in between. Now there's a lot of certified organic farms in the past 10 years, which they didn't used to have 15 years ago.
What is the process of, is it, I mean, Mike and I would be familiar with land transition, and I'm assuming it's the same, but I want to ask is it a 3-year land transition from last, we're, like I said, we're familiar with cropping systems where last time a restricted substance was put on, but what would be the standards for transitioning a sugar bush to organic?
Yeah, 3 years for think if someone's used Roundup on their land, right? There's buffer zones too. So most people haven't ever treated their woods with anything. Right? We're like, for example, we can talk about this farm. We lease land from 2 different neighbors, and they're just adjacent neighbors, which makes it easy. You can just run a pipe right across the old rock wall and start tapping their trees. But we need a forest management plan for those woods over there. Those folks needed to sign an affidavit saying they didn't use products that were non-compliant with organic on their land in the past 3 years. For the most part, transitioning land and maple is an easier process than I think what most. If you're actively running a conventional dairy and you have to transition, herds and practices, then it's a much more complicated process. The organic program in Canada is a little bit more. The standards are a little bit different than in the States, but in Vermont, most people aren't amending or spraying anyways. There are some pressures, right? Like think tent caterpillars that defoliate the trees. The caterpillars that make those little silken spider webbery on the leaves. And when they chew the leaves, they're chewing where the sugar production happens. And if you have a really high tent caterpillar pressure year, folks might be and they might be thinking about spraying, but you need to hire an aerial plane to dust spray. They make conventional sprays. They make organic sprays.
We had a terrible silkworm or whatever you call them last year. They were absolutely everywhere. But
yeah.
I've been in sugar houses. I have farmers that sugar, and I buy their maple syrup, and I become a bit of a maple syrup snob, where that's the only thing I will eat on anything, and I add it to my coffee. It's a daily routine. And I'm going to put you on the spot because when I go to other people's houses and I look in their fridge and I see, the maple syrup, but you look on the label and it's actually rice syrup with brown sugar, and I just have to shake my head. And I do judge those people. But what would you say to someone like that to get them to buy maple syrup?
So a lot of the sugars that we consume as Americans, like 70% is like corn syrup, or cane syrup. A lot of sugar is made from beets, right, in the upper Midwest, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with. A lot of sugar refinement is a pretty gross process at those scales with those types of sugars. It's a chemical process. When you support real maple syrup, on the whole, you're supporting small family farms. On the whole, you're supporting like active working lands when we talk about woodlands, right? And you're actually supporting like carbon sequestration through these things, right? Like, because you're supporting big trees staying in the ground. It's a good sugar. It's a delicious sugar. In many ways, it's a healthier sugar because it's lower on the glycemic index. It's anti-inflammatory. There's been a lot of good studies in recent years on why we should be having more good, less processed sugars and not these ultra processed sugars that the food markets have tend to favor because they're cheap, and they're cheap because they're subsidized, they're government subsidized sugars. Or maple's not a subsidized sugar. That's my short pitch.
You gave me some ammo.
Why Vermont versus Ohio, and I have less of a good pitch there. You should support your local farmer or whoever you make a connection to, right? Because it's good to know where your food is coming from, and it's good to understand. I mean, this is what we've talked about for the past hour. I mean, we all three of us, we really like to talk about farming and where food comes from because we all think it's important.
Yeah, this is really cool. I love branching out because we live in the dairy world, we live in the cattle world, but to hear the stories of other parts of agriculture and to seeing that there is positives with organics in maple sugar. There's the organic system is growing and branching out, and I think this is really exciting. I think the future for small scale agriculture is actually pretty bright. Some people may disagree with me, but to hear your story and hearing that there's more organic sugar farms out there, I think this is great. So I would like you to plug your website and where they can find your products, and also you have agritourism as well. I'd love for you to tell people to support you.
Sure. Yeah. So if you want to buy our syrup, we're at www.bairdfarm.com, and we ship syrup every day, and that's how we like it. We like to have connections with our consumers. And then we have a little shop here. If you have listeners or you're passing through Vermont ever, right attached to our sugar house, and we do offer tours. We offer agritourism almost year round here, depending on whether we have the time or not. But if you go to our website, you will see we offered one just today. A couple, we walked down to a tree, we tapped a tree with them. And so we offer an experience that isn't just like a video in a side room. Like, we really like to go out to the trees and nerd out a lot about the stuff that we kind of covered today. So that's a great experience. And we're on social media where you can see some of these things from afar, like Instagram at Baird Farm or Baird Farm Maple Syrup on Facebook.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. I really enjoyed this, and good luck with everything you guys are doing.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.